Okay, so now that we are recording, hi everyone and welcome. Good evening tonight. Thank you so much for joining us virtually. My name is Hala Alawi, and on behalf of Atmosphere Press, I am thrilled to introduce you to today's event with Colin Kersey, reading from Swimming with the Angels, which released on July 20th, and Atmosphere Press's Acquisitions Director, Kyle McCord, reading from his debut novel, Reunion of the Good Weather Suicide Cult, which celebrated its book birthday yesterday, actually. So our reading tonight will be followed by a conversation between the two authors, so everyone is in for a treat. Both Kyle's and Colin's books can be purchased through your local bookstores and online. And of course, the books can be ordered on Atmosphere Press's website at atmospherepress.com/books. Please see the links in the chat. At the end of this event, we will also have time for your questions. So throughout the event, if you have a question for our authors, go ahead and type it in the chat and we'll make sure it gets asked. During the reading, please keep yourselves muted to keep extraneous sound at a minimum. In the meantime, please do feel free to use the chat for praise and yays and comments. We at Atmosphere Press appreciate your support today and always. If you have a manuscript of your own, we'd love to read it. So feel free to submit your work to books@atmospherepress.com. As you may have experienced over the last year or so of virtual events, technical issues can happen. If they do, we'll do our best to resolve them as quickly as possible. Thank you in advance for your patience. Again, thank you so much for tuning in and supporting Colin and Kyle tonight. Let's get to it. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our first reader, Colin Kersey. Colin's writing combines hair-raising stories and vivid prose with colorful characters. His first novel, Soul Catcher, was published by St. Martin's Press. A former Washingtonian and self-described rainophobe, Colin now lives on a sunny island in Southern California, where he is employed as global PR manager for a Japanese company. He is a graduate of the University of Washington, Western Washington University, and the novel writing program at Stanford University. He is currently working on a third novel. Colin, the virtual podium is yours.
Thank you. Okay, for my reading tonight, I thought what I would do, rather than start at the beginning, because that's too easy, I thought I would read part of the back flap and then launch into chapter 7, which is a different character than the protagonist, but then quickly we'll get to the protagonist as well. So you get a little taste of both main characters in the story. Gray Reynolds' world is violently upended when assassins wound him and kill everyone else aboard a speedboat. He then learns from his dying wife that she helped steal $100 million from a notorious drug cartel. Gray's only hope of staying alive is to disappear. Forced to flee, Gray searches out a remote trout fishing farm in the foothills of the North Cascades that seems to be the perfect hideout. But his identity is not the farm's only secret. Traumatized by the loss of her mother to cancer, a young blind woman believes the mysterious stranger is the man her mother promised would one day come. Her infatuation, however, arouses the desires of her older married sister. Chapter 7. From the moment I heard Daddy stomping up the porch stairs, I could tell that something was wrong. What happened? I asked. I heard him hang up his coat and hat. When he didn't immediately tell me, I knew it was bad. We don't need his kind around here. Got an attitude, that one. Already got more than enough bad attitudes to go around here. Don't need another one. I heard a vehicle start up in the parking lot and the angry squeal of springs as it drove away. What'd you do, Daddy? I tried to sound normal, but secretly boiled with fury. Men, such fragile little egos that they must protect at all costs. Can I get some more coffee? I heard him sit at the table in his usual spot. How come you two argued? He seemed to think the pay was beneath him. Even after you explained the job included a place to stay and meals? Must have looked around and thought we were rolling in the dough. He sipped his coffee with a loud slurp. We don't need his kind. Not here anyway. What kind of money did you offer him? Same as the last one, 600. From the news programs I listened to, I thought this sounded low. Maybe you should have asked him what he thought was fair, Daddy. Don't matter now what he thinks. He's gone for good. I chased him off. I hoped he was wrong, because I seriously doubted that I could continue the charade of Daddy's little girl and being treated like the family slave much longer. Lately, while the others slept, I counted sheep and dreamed of slitting their furry little throats. Idiot. I pounded the steering wheel as I drove back the way I had come earlier, the sky growing darker by the minute as evening approached and the rain continued its unremitting assault. The narrow tree-lined road serpentined along the hillside, occasionally revealing a farm with cleared acreage and a few marooned outbuildings. All too soon, I would be back in Mount Vernon with the busy I-5 slicing through it and the decision clamoring to be made, where to go. I drove as slowly as I could and dumped the last of the aspirin bottle out onto my lap, gulped the few remaining pills, and tossed the empty container on the floor among the empty plastic water bottles and fast food wrappers. At this point, neatness no longer counted. Don't ask me why I argued with the old man. A difference of a few $100s a month or even several thousand was inconsequential to my survival. The problem was not money, after all, it was staying alive. According to Catania, the FBI agent who had interviewed me in the hospital, my only hope was to disappear so thoroughly that I could not be found by the cartel who wanted their money back and me dead. With its remote location and lack of background checks or employment forms required for new employees, the trout farm was as close to being ideal as I have been able to find, with limited resources and on such short notice. Now what? As poorly as the interview with Virgil had gone, I might as well have stayed in Southern California, saved myself 3 days of driving. The drenching cold combined with the preposterous, not to mention illegal compensation level offered, had shocked me so greatly that I had simply reacted instead of nodding in agreement. I had been within minutes, possibly seconds, of taking possession of the tiny cabin Virgil had offered me and able to lay my head down to sleep without the constant stress of worrying about where to go. Now the moment was gone and I needed a do-over. I felt the familiar swelling in my heart from Heidi's death, but there was anger too. Of all the thousands of banks, governments, and other legitimate financial entities to steal from, my wife had chosen a Mexican drug cartel notorious for cutting off the heads of their victims. Based on the ginormous amount of money changing hands every day at the hedge fund where she worked, Catania suggested she could have stolen $1 million or $2 million and possibly gotten away with it, a premise which Jeff's previous lifestyle supported before he got too greedy. No one might have noticed or taken the time to sort it out if they had. Just a rounding error, an inadvertent lapse by 2 employees digitally lobotomized by the billions of dollars rushing past their eyes on high-definition monitors, and morally impaired by the Lambos, Ferraris, Bentleys, and Aston Martins glinting in the deep shadows of the executive parking lot. If I had known about Heidi's plan, I could have stopped her, explained the risks, and pleaded for sanity. She would still be alive and we would be together right now, relaxing over a glass of wine or a margarita, watching the boats go by on a Saturday evening. Instead, I was soaking wet, hungry, suffering from hypothermia in the cab of a rusted hunk of junk with no direction and no future. My mind returned to our last night together and her outburst when I had photographed her from behind. What was that all about? With my pain and anxiety level in the red zone these past few days, I had totally forgotten about the tiny photo memory card residing in the change pocket of my jeans. Now I was curious to learn what I might have missed that day. Curiosity returned once again to anger. Damn it, Heidi, why the fuck did you do it? Whether it was the moisture in my eyes or the poor performance of the defroster, I needed to wipe the condensation from inside of the window with the saturated sleeve of my coat to see where I was going. Less than a mile from the I-5 entrance, I spotted the electronic reader board for a bar called the Beer Sheba with the slogan, "Where the beer is always cold and the women are hot." It was time to regroup and consider the options, meager as they might be. Chapter 8. What the hell happened to you? The guy sitting at the bar next to me asked. He wore a watch cap above a deeply lined face. I saw him eyeing me in the puddle of water forming beneath the bar stool suspiciously. You look like someone shot your dog and stole your wife. Or maybe it was vice versa. Either way, you need a drink. Bartender, he called out, better get this man a drink before he expires. It was a typical sports bar, so that without turning your head, you could simultaneously watch hockey and at least 3 basketball games. What can I get you? The bartender asked over the din of the crowd. Blackjack, neat, I replied. My teeth were chattering, making it hard to talk clearly. Well, the old guy asked after I had the first sip, what was it, dog or wife? I had a job interview that didn't go well, I said. Let me guess, was you trying out to be a lifeguard or maybe a deep sea diver? He chuckled. Or maybe a fisherman on one of those Alaskan trawlers? He cackled. I swear, I never saw someone looking so drowned and depressed in my life. I tried to smile, but my face was still so frozen, I'm not sure how it might have looked. I took another swallow before answering. Maintenance job on a farm. He took a drink from a long neck beer bottle and burped before adding, what was the problem, if you don't mind my asking? Problem? I considered. I guess it was me. That goes without saying, young man, he said. I didn't realize how low the compensation was. He turned around in his bar stool so he was facing me. He took another long pull on his beer. There was this Cherokee fellow from Oklahoma I rode with years ago. He had more colorful expressions than you could shake a stick at. Keep the shiny side up, that kind of thing. He once told me that the difference between homeless and hopeful is a job, whether you're living on the res or in Manhattan. Said we need to be doing something every day, no matter how menial or low paid. It's in our DNA. I savored the whiskey. In my current weary and waterlogged state, it was warming, comforting. If you were looking for advice, I'd recommend you get some warm food and get dried out before giving that job another shot. He clapped me on the shoulder and dried his hand on his jeans. I grimaced. I don't think there's any going back, not after the owner told me to get off his property. Ran you off, did he? The old guy frowned. Of course, another thing that crazy Indian said was never look a dead horse in the mouth. I have no clue what that means, but I believe it may fit the present occasion. Ready for another, the bartender asked. Just my check, I said. Give it to me, Bob, the old guy said, and bring me some more stale nuts when you get a second. He nodded at me. Your turn next time. Thanks, I said, for the drink and the advice. Listen, he said, as long as we're talking advice, look for an open door, one that ain't been slammed in your face. I hate to say it, but you are shit out of luck on that other one. Time to cross it off your list and move on to something new. That's just me talking, not the Indian. Tapping on the pickup truck's window woke me from a miserable sleep. I pushed up from the well-warmed seat where I had spent the past hour or so curled into a tight ball and rubbed my eyes. It was after 10 p.m. according to my watch. As I rolled the window down, I was surprised to see Valerie huddled under an umbrella, looking tiny as a woodland fairy in the moonless night, and the dog crouched beside her, trying to avoid the rain. Heard someone drive up a while back, and seeing how late it was, figured it must be you. She held up something wrapped in tinfoil and a blanket. Made you a sandwich, and here's something to help you stay warm. Why are you doing this? Depends. She wiped a wet strand of dark hair away from her face. You staying or going? Your dad says he won't hire me, but I thought I'd ask him to reconsider in the morning. I don't exactly have anywhere else I need to be. Breakfast is at 6, she said. Daddy insists on bacon and eggs every morning. Come up to the house and be ready to make your case by then. She stroked the dog between the ears. Come on, Patsy, let's go in where it's warm and dry. Hey, before you go, is he serious about $600 a month? Oh, Daddy is serious about everything, but that doesn't mean you can't ask for more. She smiled. I figure you're worth at least $650. The doc grinned happily as she led Valerie back to the house.
Thank you, Colin. Our second reader tonight is Kyle McCord. It's awesome to be able to keep the new book celebration going tonight. Kyle McCord is the author of 7 books, including National Poetry Series finalist Magpies in the Valley of Oleanders, X-Rays and Other Landscapes, and Reunion of the Good Weather Suicide Cult. He has work featured in Agni, Blackbird, Boston Review, the Gettysburg Review, the Harvard Review, the Kenyon Review, Plowshares, Tri-Quarterly, and elsewhere. He has received grants and awards from the Academy of American Poets, the Vermont Studio Center, and the Baltic Writing Residency. He serves as executive editor of Gold Wake Press and teaches at Drake University in Des Moines. He is married to visual artist Lydia McCord, and they have an adorable son named August. Kyle, take it away.
Thank you. Thanks, and thanks to Cami and Hala for organizing this. And Colin, what a terrific reading. That was so great to get to hear that out loud. I will level with all of you. This is the 3rd time I've ever read fiction. Then last night was number 2. So this is try number 3. And so I've been just trying different segments from the book. So the premise of the book is that our main character, Tom Duncan, has been part of this community called the Good Weather Community, where everyone died in a cult suicide except Tom. So it's grim from the get-go, let's put it that way, unequivocally. So part of what's gone wrong is you'd think that would be the worst, and so he's inadvertently survived. He's the only person, and to make matters worse, there is a Netflix documentary that has come out and blamed him for everything. And so I'm trying a section from later, and part of the reason I'm doing it, to be totally honest with you, is that I get to read in the voice of Rain, who is the megalomaniac leader of the Good Weather Community, who's just become deranged. And I figure, well, if I get to read anything, I probably want to read that. So I guess that says more about me as a person than anything else. So here is, this is from late in the book, and it's the Netflix documentary sort of covering this story. From the 2020 Netflix documentary series, The Good Weather, Episode 10, F-100 tornadoes, the falls at the end of the world, the aftermath. A pudgy farmer in overalls sits in front of the camera. A caption identifies him as Dwight. His face is framed with glasses which seem oversized. He rubs his huge, rough hands together. Don Burlington, the director, narrates. On the night of August 7th, 2019, farmer Dwight Fuller sat at his kitchen table outside Edenburg, Iowa. He was filling out forms to enter some of his more exceptional vegetables in contests at the upcoming state fair. His wife had set kidney beans to soak for a casserole destined for a sick neighbor. Their older son had recently enrolled in classes at Iowa State University and was attending an orientation in Ames, but their younger son was upstairs completing a summer school assignment. The documentary switches to Dwight. About 7:30, we start hearing the siren going off at Good Weather. Because they farmed, they kept a weather siren, and whoever was in charge of it seemed to have an itchy trigger finger. So when it started sounding, I looked over at Ida and we both sort of shrugged. But after about 10 minutes of it, I figured there might be something to it. I asked Ida to switch over to channel 5, but there wasn't nothing about funnel clouds. It was weird. There was no one was over there was tending to the siren, so I went to take a look out on the porch. There was practically no wind, and I could see the stars big and bright. Ida says I better call over there since we had a number for their store. I called, but no one picked up. That is when I started to think something was up, on account of their always kept the store open kind of late. Dwight pinches his nose, considering what to say next. Well, by this point, Keaton has come downstairs and he wants to know why the siren is going. He can't concentrate on math. I'm at a loss because I only know about the one phone number over there. Ida thought we should call the sheriff, but it seemed like we might be overreacting. I said, I'll go over there and take a look. Maybe take Keaton with me. She said there was no way in hell he was going near that camp. So I set off by my lonesome. I started coming through the west pasture and I see they got a bonfire going out on the soccer field, like mammoth logs stacked skyward. So as soon as I seen that, I took out my cell to dial the sheriff because one loose bit of kindling and you got a prairie fire for sure. The sheriff, Sam, and I went to high school together. He knows me. I don't call unless it's something serious. The phone rings right through to him. I told him about the siren and such. He said he'd get a deputy and come down. When I get off the phone, I figure I'll go see if someone is at least tending that big fire. There's a slight rise when you hit the windbreak. So when I got there, I spied over the wire gate because from there you could see down the slope and down onto their soccer field. Once I got a good look there, I stopped dead. Dwight shakes his head. I couldn't believe it. The interview cuts away and the scene fades to black. The final chorus of American Pie by Don McLean plays. Then the documentary shows the image of a tranquil creek passing through woods. On the bank opposite the camera, a doe laps at the stream. It all began with water. In 1992, rain used the Earth's water system as the central metaphor of good weather, as the linchpin of his argument for a whole way of life. In a decade when Iowans were ever more aware of their tenuous relationship with that precious resource, the message rang true. Good weather grew dramatically, and rain positioned himself as the messianic figure of his own faith. The doe catches sight of the camera crew and recesses into the woods. Sadly, water was also the good weather community's undoing. The documentary cuts to found night vision footage of a storage closet in a compound. A hand pulls open a closet door. Inside are pharmaceutical bottles stripped of any identifying marks. According to forensic toxicologists and detectives who examined the property, it appears that in early July of 2019, rain began spiking the good weather community's water supply with a cocktail of crushed morning glory seeds, salvia, and psilocybin. The latter he was able to obtain with the help of a pharmacologist named Lindsay Stenson, who was an on-again, off-again member of Good Weather since the early 2000s. Officers believe Fairbanks blackmailed Stenson, who later killed herself. Toxicology reports revealed Rain did not drink the tainted water himself, but even without ingesting drugs, by July he had become increasingly erratic. In his sermons, he focused on an event alternately called F100 or Cresting the Falls at the End of the World. The documentary cuts to a recording of Rain as he speaks in Estuary Chapel. Sweat beads his bald head. He wears long robes which trail behind him. He prowls back and forth on the stage like a panther stalking the edges of its cage. The world out there, it's getting sicker and sicker, y'all. Sicker and sicker. When we started Good Weather, we were worried about what? About plastic in our waterways, shoot-em-ups on our evening television, promiscuity on campus, divorce, increasing CO2, and spiritual decay and deadness in our churches. And don't get me wrong, all of that, it was overwhelming. The world needed and still needs the good weather message. Am I right? He points to the audience who clap in agreement. But the kinds of sickness now, man, it's hard to even take the pulse of it. Pornography at the touch of a button, on demand, any hour of the day, polar ice caps melting, whole states on fire, phony for-profit pastors living in their mansions. Yeah, shame on them. They're going to be begging for the good rain to fall when they're burning in the great flame, but they're going to be chained to those flames like not a soul in this world to save them. Rain races forward in a sudden manic motion and raises his voice. True scripture, pour down upon us, oh true scripture, make us the good well. Members of the community nod in agreement, some speaking unintelligible prayers, but I had another message last night. And this is important, so listen up. A hush comes over estuary. I was sleeping in my bed. Suddenly, I hear this voice calling me, and I'm awake. In front of me, there's this angel, but he's different than any angel I've seen before. His body is the complete absence of light, pure darkness, and there's wind swirling inside him. It's furious and howling like he's made of weather itself. When the angel speaks, its voice is pure thunder. At first I'm paralyzed, but then it says, arise, reign the prophet, for I have a message for you from the true scripture. So I shoot out of bed and grab a pen and pad off the note saying, the angel says, the message I bring must be inscribed in flesh. He reaches out and lays a single finger of pure darkness on my temple. Rain mimes the motion, gently reaching to touch an audience member. Rain is unctuous with perspiration and pants heavily. And I feel this insane burning, like someone is drilling through my skull. I thought my brain would explode, but when he's done, I know what I'm about to tell you now, as though it's written, I'd written it 1,000 times. I know it like I know the sound of my own voice. Here's the news. The big finish is coming. The end of the rat race. The terminus. The falls at the end of the world are just ahead. We're going over first because you won't like what comes next if you stay. Our place to Shemayim in Shemayim is ready. We need to GTFO. Get the F out, my friends. The crowd is silent. Then the front row rise and applaud and others follow. It's right there, this temple. But when do we leave? Now that is tricky. I might need your help with this one. After he seared the true scripture into my memory, the angel led me into my window. And listen close, y'all. Soccer field is a giant coastline. Spires of rock and 1,000-foot crashing waves. Then there was a big serpent throwing fish into its open mouth. And I could tell that was the malevolence, our enemy, the one polluting our world as we speak. And as I'm watching, the mist moves off the shore. And behold, a golden boat with masts as tall as this roof, maybe twice as tall, and pure silken sheets falling down from every one of the yards. It was unbelievable. My breath caught my throat, and the angel said, any who join you in the craft will be saved, but all who remain shall be swallowed by the serpent. He pointed at the serpent, and it let out a terrible yowl, so that my bones rattled in my body, and I felt my nephesh dance in my throat. I fell down praising because so many of you will be saved, and I begged that none be left behind. Then the angel lifted me up and told me that we must watch for the appointed time. I asked when we should set sail, and the angel said, many will have dreams and visions, and that will be your only sign. Then the angel drew a golden sword. I was afraid, so I bowed my head, but he dove headfirst into the winds, into himself, and he was gone. When I looked outside, the beach and the serpent had vanished. But I heard that shattering yowl. I believe it was a warning to anyone who doubts the moment is coming. Rain pauses, visibly shaking, and sits on the step. He looks sallow and emaciated. He motions for someone off screen to bring him a drink. Thames rushes forward with a bottle of water and a towel. He accepts both, and she retreats off screen. Now who? Rain pauses to chug part of the bottled water, then place the towel on his head. Who here has been having dreams, maybe seeing visions? Hands shoot up all over the chapel. Soon every hand in the building is raised. Thanks, guys.
Thank you for those readings, Kyle and Colin. And now, actually, I'll turn the mic back over to the two of you for our author conversation portion of the night. To our lovely audience members, sit back and enjoy. And of course, feel free to chime in via our chat with comments and questions for our authors. All right, Colin and Kyle, go ahead.
So I might, if it's okay with you, Colin, I might lead off with a question for you. And I think this is, I phrased it as a question that for other writers, but it's a little bit of a selfish question because I think it's, I'm always thinking about it. So I said, I think many young writers struggle with this and would welcome your wisdom. How do you know when work is finished?
So first of all, just let me say, if I could hire you to read for me, I would, because you did an amazing job. That was very cool what you did. So in answer to the question, that is really a great question. And I'm not sure that my answer will satisfy young writers, because as you know, when you write the end of the book, that's not when the book is finished. Sometimes you've only just begun. And in my case, that was really the case. I think I wrote a good ending, but it was not, the book was not finished. And it took a lot of work to finally get there. And then, to cut this story short, it was you, Kyle, and you playing editor and telling me to put this in and take that out that allowed me to make the final changes that needed to be made, because I was really struggling with what's it going to take to shut the door in this book. I finished it many times, but it was not done. So I think that it takes sometimes that editor or somebody that doesn't have a vested interest in it, hasn't written it and put all the time and energy into it, probably not a spouse, because sometimes that can be difficult to deal with, shut the door on. So it's probably best to have an editor somewhere who can tell you, here's what needs to be done, and you accept their professional opinion because they have no axe to grind. So here's a question for you. That section you just read, Kyle, is extremely creepy. It's got all kinds of biblical references in it as well. But it scared the life out of me as I was reading this book. And again, as you were reading that section, what caused you to come up with this idea for your first novel? What was the impetus, the inspiration?
Patrick, Colin, I feel like your question is kind of, I hope it sort of also is the question of, why have you not yet sought help, Kyle? So this is the true origin of this story, is that my wife and I were watching this documentary about we were watching a documentary about Heaven's Gate, right? The cult in the 90s, where it was pretty wild. A lot of it was based on Star Trek, and they believed that they were going to ride the comet, which comet? Hale-Bopp, right? They were going to ride Hale-Bopp. And so one of the rules of that cult was that if you had any sort of sexual indiscretion, you got banished. And so one of the guys got banished right before the big finale for them. And so he was still a die-hard believer. And so he had one of the things they revealed in this documentary was that there was a reunion afterwards of people who had family members survive, and then this guy, And then other people who really truly believed in this. And I thought, man, to be a fly on the wall of that. And then that idea kept spinning. And then I never stopped and sort of put it down. But your question is a good one, Colin, which was, I think that I've actually been researching this book for a very long time. One of the things I guess I haven't mentioned before is that I worked as a volunteer for Brethren Volunteer Service, and I served in this very conservative district that was very evangelical, and I basically worked as a coordinator for all these different churches. And so I learned, like, what is the kind of language that really revs people up, that really gets them going. And so I took the worst possible, and bear in mind, none of them were like Rain. Rain is like the most insidious version of that. But I was like, what if you took these people who are truly convicted and believe, and you just took it to the most perverse sort of ends? This is what you wind up with, right? And that's where I can sort of conjure that voice from. And he creeps me out too. He creeps me out a lot. And he's really based on David Koresh, right, of the Branch Davidians. He's a combination of that, and then like, you know, some maybe like Manson or something, right? But that's why I like reading from in his voice in a way, is because it's one of the strangest voices I've ever been able to conjure, right, in some way. And you know about this, Colin, right? You've got a lot of characters with very diverse voices within your novel. So well, thank you for, it's a wonderful question, so thank you. I have one other question for Colin, and he said I can't ask him the question about which member of the Paw Patrol he is or would be, which is again a question from a man with a 3-year-old. So I'll ask him a more interesting question. And so, Colin, what scene in the book were you most excited to write, and why, when you set out?
So that's another great question, because what happened was I had written this totally from the first person of my protagonist, and during an exercise in the Stanford writing program that I attended, which they had just started, I believe, the year before. It's a 2-year program. You have to submit work, and it's totally online. And you have some wonderful teachers that are published authors, people like Carolyn Levitt and so forth. And so you have inspiring people that you're working with, and there are textbooks, and there are also you're reading fiction, and you're criticizing each other's work. Anyway, one of the exercises, and I don't even recall which of the teachers it was to take one of your, not the main character, another character, and write a scene in their voice. And so I took my young blind woman whose mother died when she was just a little girl, was left her, her mother was her best friend, her campfire leader, her everything, in addition to being her mom. And here she is, a blind girl, and she's living at home, and really her dog is her only companion. And the rest of the family expects her to do all this work. So I wanted to get in her head. And as a writer, it's challenging to write in the head of somebody who's handicapped, because you have to research it, but really in the end, it's, you got to flip your imagination on it, just go with it and see what happens, and then see if people find it believable or not. And so I wrote this little bit, and starting it off, and I just remember that it kind of electrified me as I did it. Let's see if I can find it here real quickly. Okay, it was the beginning of chapter 3, and this is the first time we meet this character. And she says, "You can feel the night. It is alive with sound, smell, touch, taste, and mystery. A living, breathing thing, electric with possibilities and danger. It's all I know. It's called ROP, short for retinopathy of prematurity. I weighed just 2.5 pounds when I was born, 30 weeks into mama's pregnancy. It was common back then for hospitals to use high levels of oxygen and incubators to save the lives of preemies like me. Unfortunately, they think that is what burned up my retinas and left me permanently blind. So I wrote this scene and it changed the whole book for me. I thought, okay, this is cool. I've got to work in more of Valerie. And that's what I did. So my next question for you, and by the way, you used an incredible word, conjure, which certainly felt appropriate for what you did with Rain. But talking about your protagonist, poor Tom, here's a family man who has been betrayed by his wife. He's been distanced by his daughter. He's unable to be with his granddaughter. He's accosted at every turn. And what a poor, miserable man. You, as a family man, the 3-year-old, I'm sure just felt for this guy. How did you do this? What was your thinking in the character of Tom?
Well, it's a wonderful question and not something someone has asked me before, so I appreciate it. Yeah, so one of the rules I learned about fiction writing very early from one of my friends was he said, okay, you got to imagine it like a graph, right? And I think this comes from maybe Charles Wright or someone like that. And he said, okay, you have to imagine there's it's a direct correlation line and you move back and forth across it. So you have to be able to say, okay, well, something good happens, something bad happens, something good happens, something bad happens. And you're right, Tom gets kind of kicked over and over again in the story. But part of what happens is that he does get some opportunities, like he's getting to be with his granddaughter, but then of course, that gets taken away, and that all happens kind of early in the story. The funny thing is, Colin, when I first wrote this story, when I first wrote the book, one of my beta readers is always my dad. My wife and my dad both read the book. I say it's a very McCord-centered book because they, put huge amounts of input into it. My dad wrote me a 13-page letter about the book. And in the original version of the book, Tom was a much worse guy. And he's like, I hate Tom. I want him to be separated from his family. He's just an abysmal human being. And I was like, okay, well, I got to make Tom a better guy because obviously you had a very strong reaction to this as my audience. When I was thinking about who Tom Duncan was, Tom is interesting because I wanted someone who gets pulled into things very easily, right? He's willing to be kind of drugged along by his wife, by Rain, and then later by the other members of the community in some ways, right? And one of the dangers of that is you can get somebody who's just constantly complaining about their plight, right? Who's like, oh, I'm suffering, etc. But I wanted Tom to be someone who, in the midst of all of these terrible things, has different parts of him that have that kind of wisdom, right? And so I hope I'm answering your question here, which is I think that Tom, to me, is a guy who is really defined. Like, I always think about what is it that defines a character? What is it that they want? And what Tom wants more than anything is not to be a part of this story anymore. More than anything, he wants to not be in my book, right? And so all I was thinking about as I was thinking about it was, at the end, he has lost so much, but I think the best scene for me to write is, and this, I don't think this spoils anything, there's a moment where they're in the kitchen and they're all getting to be kind of a family again, even though everything is all broken around them. And I thought, that's kind of the story I wanted to get to. That's the moment I wanted to get to. And I wanted that for Tom. My wife, by the way, won't read the last 30 pages or so because she's read them a couple times. And she's like, that's the sad part. That's the really sad part. And that I won't read. And so I think that, but I think sometimes for Tom, that is the part that is finally catharsis, right? Or something like it. Colin, it's a great question. Thank you. And I think you've got a question right here from Scott. So Scott wanted to know, where did the idea for your novel come from?
So quite often the story ideas come from a combination of things. In this case, it started with a relationship issue. I mean, how well do we really know the people we marry, especially if we've not known them for many years? And so I think I've been shocked, to learn that somebody had different habits or ideas about things than I thought maybe they had. So that was probably an impetus for it, but also I was reading, as I'm always doing, and I saw an article about SWIFT, which is the super secret banking organization. It's headquartered in Belgium, and it handles several $1 trillion of transfers and money every day. So people at hedge funds and banks just use it because it's their tool, right? And so I had a friend who actually did work at a hedge fund, and I asked him, hey, how hard would it be to hack this thing if you, say, worked at a hedge fund? And I said, would it be possible? And he said, yeah, I think so. And so I wrote a scene and I said, what do you think? And he said, yeah, I think that would work. So then I just pushed this. I took my character, had him married to a young woman. They're not starving, but they have big dreams, and they've been kind of stymied, and they're in a very rich part of the world. And she happens to work for a hedge fund, and her boss, an IT guy, says, hey, it's not that hard. We just got to cover our tracks. We set this in the middle of the night and we hide the money and no problem. So she does this. She steals, hacks $100 million. And unfortunately, it's the worst possible organization that she inadvertently hacks it from. It's a cartel who's laundering their money. So that sets the novel in motion.
Great, yeah. And Scott also wanted to know, actually wanted to ask both of you, what was the hardest part of writing your respective novels?
Colin, I'll let you go first here and then I'll chime in.
Well, the hardest part is getting it right. I mean, you can slap words down on paper, but until, it's reached a point where people say, wow, I like this. And that's what we all want as writers, right? We want people to say, damn, this is a good book. And that's not easy to get to. That's for me. I mean, it's maybe for Kyle, maybe it's easy, but it's not for me. It's a load of work.
Well, no, and I take it as a personal honor to have that suggested, but no, I'm in the same boat as you, Colin. I think the hardest part for me, Scott, there was a moment in I didn't stall very much when I was writing the book. I think sometimes getting the first few chapters down sometimes is very difficult. And I rewrote the first chapter of this book like wholly 5 times because I kept messing up where it was supposed to start. I always talk to people about occasion, but it's clear that that's not my best, that's not my best thing that I can do. I hit a moment where I was about 2/3 of the way there, and I could see the finish line of where the book was going to go, but I didn't necessarily. There was a moment, and I would be giving spoilers to say it. So what I'll tell you is, there's a moment late in the book where I knew where the end was, but there were about 10,000 pages, 10,000 words. There were about 10,000 pages. I didn't know what was going to happen. No, there were about 10,000 words where I didn't know what it was going to be. And I think one of the things you do really well, Colin, in your book, and Scott, this is true in your book too, is letting the characters act out what is the next move. So letting them decide for you in a way, like they're going to organically make a set of choices, and those choices are going to inform what comes next. And so I had to let them play things out a little bit, and that was tricky because as the writer, you want to have that narrative grip and be able to say, "Oh, I know what's going to come next. They're going to do this," right? But instead, it was like, okay, well, I have to let them play out the scene a little bit. One of the great fiction rules I've always heard is when you feel sure that you're going to turn the camera out of a scene, give it 5 seconds longer. Stay a little bit longer, because what you get is that extra friction, that extra moment. It's the in the Frost Nixon interview, it's the moment when you see Nixon crestfallen, right? That's what you want to stick around for. Yeah.
All right. We also have another question for you, Kyle. Cam wants to know, what was something new you experienced in the writing of fiction that you hadn't yet experienced or experimented with in your poetry?
Amy, it's a good question. So I've been teaching I've been teaching students all day, and students will always give you the easiest possible answer. So if this was their question, they'd be like, writing more words, right? Like, it's the lamest possible answer. But something there's actually a lot that I hadn't experienced. One of which is like, I think that I will give you the most sort of immediately revelatory for me, which is, I'd cultivated this audience over the years, and it was really interesting. It's been really interesting to me to see them interact with the characters. And for example, my wife's best friend who read it said she picked one character named Thames, and she said, "Thames, I like Thames. Thames is just like me." And I was like, well, that's tricky because Thames is me. That's my personality mapped onto one of the characters. So I was like, that's sort of a strange idea. But like any other character, I'm sure that Colin would probably agree with this. You take certain features of your personality or people and kind of map it onto the character, right? You're like, oh, this is this person who I know, right? There's Cammy Rio in my book is it probably Aaron Stalkup, or a close approximation of Aaron Stalkup, a different version, or like, and so something that's been different is seeing people in the audience map themselves onto my characters, many of whom are very problematic, and that's been really interesting, but exciting and fun. And I joke because I do the exact same thing with my own characters. So
yeah, I guess you can learn new things about the people in your life just from that.
Yes, indeed you can.
And then we'll just take one more question for the night before we wrap things up. Jesse wants to know, or to ask both authors, what is your process for getting your ideas out of your head and onto a page? Do you map it out ahead of time, or do you start writing with no end in sight? In other words, what works for you to get a first draft down?
I'm going to let Colin answer this, and I'm going to go get something. I'll be right back.
Okay. So again, this is a little bit of a tricky question. Thank you, Jesse. Jesse is my daughter, by the way. Brilliant girl. Anyway, so I love writing scenes and I love developing characters, but you can only go so far with that, or you do something that I think I heard a teacher once call spaghettiing, where things just go shooting off in all directions. That's not a good thing. You want to control that. So to have a controlled narrative, because Kyle is also right, your characters start to spin the story themselves, but you've got to have an overall map. So you start off knowing that you're in Los Angeles and you want to get to New York City. You don't know where all the stops you're going to be at, but you at least have to have some direction. You may need to reinvent that as you go, because again, your characters are taking over and they want to go to Florida for some reason. So it's a combination. Like I said, I like to write scenes, write characters, but you also have to have some kind of an outline, at least in your head, of this is where I want to go with this. And then things develop.
Yeah. I'm like Colin. There's the pantser and the pacer. I don't remember. I've never understood the analogy, but there's apparently a dichotomy people make about this, about the certain amount of spontaneity and then a certain amount of having things organized. So this tells you the kind of writer I am, which is, so this little booklet is all the proto version of the story. And then what I want to show you is about here, it stops working, which is about halfway through. And so that's where I was like, this is what I thought I was going to do. And here's where it went off the rails. And now I'm doing something else. And so by the time I got to these last sort of notes and guideposts for myself, Colin is dead right. The characters were doing their own thing. They were like, no, this is how the story goes, right? And also, my wife read the story and she was following chapter by chapter, and she said, no, that's not what the characters are going to do. Here's what's going to happen. So it's funny for me to read this version of the book, because it's like, well, this is a totally different book. Also, humorously, on the front of it, the thing on the front says, and this is from one of my old teachers, I think being a poet is a form of civil disobedience. And I thought, as I picked this up, I thought, well, the most disobedient thing is a poet then writing a novel. So this seems absolutely appropriate, right? In so many ways. But no, that's what I have to do, is I had to put everything down, and then I had to basically, show my wife kind of chapter by chapter. And then at a certain point, you just let the story, you make sure your characters are in the right room. You have an idea where things are going to go. And you get that kind of organic development. I mean, most of the great stories, and you'll notice cinema's often my referent here, most of the great moments in cinema happen spontaneously, or they're set out spontaneously, right? And I think is no surprise.
So Kyle, do you ever have since you do your story with your wife, do you ever have a moment where you go, no, wait, don't tell me this. You're ruining this for me. And I mean,
oh no, absolutely. Okay. Oh yeah, no. My wife has so at one point I was writing this scene late in the book, and she said, well, Tom's already done that. And I said, no, he hasn't. And I got real mad about it. And then I went and looked at the scene. And I was like, damn it, you're right. And then I stayed up for 2 hours rewriting the scene, right? And I was like, now you look at it again. I was like real mad about it. But she was like 100% right. I mean, my dad's notes too. He said things like he actually rewrote one of the scenes from the book. And I think he thought I would be upset about it. I was like, no, I'll just use that. So I just typed it up and put it in, right? And so great, what is it? Good poets borrow, great poets steal. So why not, right? So anyway, no, I'm sure this experience of you share with someone and they tell you exactly what's wrong with it, and they're 100% right. And the more right they are, the more angering it is. And so yes, no, I'm in answer to your question, Colin, I am indeed human. Thank you.
All right. Well, this was so great to hear from both of you. Thank you so much to Colin Kersey and Kyle McCord for your words and your brains and your generosity. And thank you for everyone being here with us to celebrate these fabulous authors. Don't forget that you can order Swimming with the Angels and Reunion of the Good Weather Suicide Cult from the links in the chat. Please also consider checking out atmospherepress.com to browse our new and forthcoming releases, to sign up for our email newsletter, or to submit a book manuscript of your own. Feel free to submit your work to books@atmospherepress.com and let us know that you attended today's event. We look forward to hearing from you. And that's it. Have a safe and wonderful evening, everyone. Good night.
Thanks, friends.
Thank you.
Thank you.